we have different forms of ingesting the iron molecule. The way of actual ferrosulfate or in the multivitamins furamate or gluconate. As you can see, we have different ways of presentation. The most common presentation is gastrointestinal. That again, the patient, at early stages, 30 minutes or less, the patients would have nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and it goes up to the point of liver failure, having GI bleed, as you can see, hematemesis, melena, or hematopegia. And then soon enough, the patient goes into the cerebrovascular phase of the ultramental status, somnolence, lethargy, coma, up to the point of seizure, okay? Patient might improve if, again, there's no liver failure. In the case if the patient has no liver failure, since we have, remember, enzymes that highly catalyze the excess of ferrosulfate, but if at any point you go into liver failure or you had as underlying chronic condition any liver cirrhosis, for example, that would not take place. The patient might go into shock. If the patient goes into liver failure, the full-blown hepatotoxicity might take up to 48 hours, but you know already the consequences of that, okay? So how do you diagnose the patient with iron toxicity? First of all, you have to do an iron level, okay? Suspect it first. Suspect it, do an iron level. This is the type of toxidrome that you will be able to see the pills in the stomach by doing a KUB, if of course this patient came in the first 24 hours, that there is not enough pills or the active content being absorbed already by the duodenum, because a radio peak. So if you do a KUB, you might be able to see the pills still in the stomach. Of course, you're going to do an ABG, and basically, what's the most common acid-base imbalance that you're expecting? High iron gap metabolic acidosis with a compensatory respiratory alkalosis until the patient tires up, right? And becomes somnolent lethargy, then you start retaining CO2, and the patients go on the contrary into respiratory acidosis, which is a mixed acidosis. Remember that, I'm not going to ask you this yet, but when we go to acid-base imbalance, you will see that these type of patients, because they have third space edema, that means that the vascular space is depleted and they're in hypovolemic shock. These are the patients that are in metabolic alkalosis as well due to dehydration. Okay? So you would see acid-base imbalance when we start that topic, that you could have both in the same patient. Okay? And of course, you're going to do your CMP expectations of the electrolyte. Well, if the patient is in metabolic acidosis, patients will be most likely in hyperkalemia, even though you might see some patients in hypo as well. But the most common presentation is hyperkalemia. BUN and creatinine could be normal up to the point of acute kidney injury, right? Pre-renal in this case. Glucose level, remember, and I emphasized over and over last week and the week before when we started covering toxidromes, and even today in simulation. Remember that this patient going to an aerobic cascade, there's highly consumption of glucose. Even if the glucose level is normal, you must provide glucose to the patient, okay? So, liver function test. Why? Because again, in the first and early stages of the disease, the patients have a high probability, even though many don't go that way, because if we have a good liver function and good catabolism through the enzymes, we can catalyze the iron and nothing happens. But the majority of the patients, 80% or more, go to liver failure, so you have to do the liver function test and follow that up. Remember that one-time level iron or any one-time level of any toxidrome is not enough, right? You at least have to repeat every 4 hours, because there's a possibility of capsules that are enteric, avoiding the duodenum or extended release, etc. Okay? What will you see on PT and PT and INR? Remember, prolongation, because the liver is in charge of the coagulation cascade, so that will be affected. Patients will have signs and symptoms of bleeding. And CBC with differential, remember that any toxidrome taking the patient to anaerobic cascade produces ischemia and hopefully not cell death, right? So major hemolysis happens and patients can have hemolytic anemia and thrombocytopenias, okay? Always do a tap and cross because the patient's having hemolytic anemia, you might have to transfuse, and on top of that, having hematemesis and melena, that would be one of the possibilities as well. So again, the treatment, as we said, the majority of these patients come in already in the first 24 hours without tormentor status, so you must secure the airway even before you try to do gastric decompression and activate a charcoal, right? Because you know when it's coming on your test that you cannot do gastric lavage or provoke vomiting or instilling activated charcoal if you don't have a secure way, because it has to be done through an NG2, even though we do it in clinical practice, right? Guideline, concentrate, all right? So even if the patient is volume overload, which the patient in simulation was as well, it doesn't matter. You have to flush the toxidrome out, right? And even more, most of the time these patients will be in hypotension. It doesn't matter that the fluid is in the third space. It doesn't even matter if the patient is in pulmonary edema. You have already a secure airway. Pump that tissue that is going through tissue hyperperfusion. Then after that, when the patient recuperates, you can either take the patient to dialysis or do diuresis. Do you understand? All right? So who cares if the patient is in volume overload? You can also do bowel irrigation. Remember that when you do a KUB, hopefully it's in the active phase, the first 24 hours, and you still have pills in the stomach. So not only you can actually do gastric lavage, but you can only lavage the stomach. You cannot lavage the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, right? So for that, you can also do bowel irrigation and even use cathartics, which are laxative. This is the major antidote, okay? So that is called chelation therapy with the ferroxamine, all right? And I'm not gonna ask you those. Any questions? All right? So here as a summary, okay, you have the majority of the antidotes that we use in clinical practice for toxidromes. So as you can see, we already have discussed acetaminophen toxicity, right? And N-acetylcysteine is the antidote for that. For patients that have anticholinergic agents, remember that anticholinergic agents are the nicotinic agonists, right? Yes. And basically you are giving anticholinesterase or cholinesterase inhibitors. And those cholinesterase inhibitors are the medications that you give to the patient that have myasthenia gravis and patients that have Alzheimer's disease, right? So you're basically providing acetylcholine. For benzodiazepine, the antidote is flumazenil, romacicone. We already have gone through that. We didn't talk about beta blockers. But beta blocker toxicity, basically, what do you expect to see in a patient with beta blocker toxicity? Heart blocks. Severe bradycardia and heart blocks. Sometimes the patients come in syncope, right? The majority of them. So if the patient is in metoprolol, atenolol, labetalol, any type of beta blocker, the major antidote is glucagon. Why? What's glucagon? If you're beta blocking, what you should do to reverse the beta blockage effect. In addition to that, what was an antagonist for? What was an antagonist in pharmacology?
It attaches to the beta blocker receptor, no?
It blocks the receptors, but it doesn't do any action whatsoever. It just displays the medication to attach to the receptor, right? Yes or no? It's actually having an alpha agonist effect, all right? And in addition to that, you can, because the beta blockers can produce, do you remember that they mask the effect of signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia, right? But beta blockage, when you have a major blockage of cardiac conduction, patients can go not only in hypoglycemia, but hyperkalemia. So to treat, I mean, you're trying to treat the same, basically you treat the hyperkalemia that might kill the patient first, right? Because you might have QT prolongation, right? And high peak T waves, that the patients might go into myocardial infarction faster than dying from hypoglycemia. So you give the insulin for hyperkalemia, but at the same time, giving the dextrose, not only you allowed or avoid further hypoglycemia, but you're treating the hypoglycemia at the same time. Do you understand? All right? And the calcium gluconate or calcium chloride is just to diminish the irritability of the heart. So basically to allows a refractory period to happen faster. Do you remember in pharmacology when we talked about refractory period, and you have an absolute refractory period, and it went away? Correct. Okay, so let's see if you remember this. Okay? Depolarization and repolarization, right? So depolarization is the sodium gates open and sodium enters the cell, right? Normally, again, the sodium is outside, the potassium is inside. So when the cell depolarizes by an action potential, the sodium goes in, right? Potassium goes out, right? So during that event of depolarization, even if you activate the membrane again, even if you do another stimulate, the membrane will never depolarize again. In contraction, when you're contracting, you don't keep contracting. Otherwise, you will go into status epilepticus if it's related to seizure, or you might go into a systolic cardiac arrest, right? If you're continuously contracting on the heart, or you go into rhabdomyolysis if you're continuously contracting the skeletal muscle. That's the purpose of it. That's called absolute refractory period. But when the membrane polarity goes back to normal, it means that sodium goes back in and potassium goes inside. That's repolarization, relaxation. During the initial phases of repolarization, if the membrane receives another stimuli, it can depolarize again. Okay? So in order to avoid in order to avoid early depolarization in the initial stages of repolarization, which is called relative refractory period, okay, you give calcium gluconate in any patient that has a major electrolyte imbalances. So in other words, guys, you have memorized this. What do you give for hyperkalemia, for example? You give insulin, right? Followed by glucose. That only does bring in the potassium inside the cell. What else can you do? Eliminate the potassium through the intestine, chiaxylate, right? What else can you do? Try to eliminate the potassium through the kidney, right? Dialysis, yes? Or Lasix, right? Why do you give calcium gluconate? Does it do anything of bringing the potassium inside the cell and avoiding hyperkalemia? No. It's just that potassium being elevated means that the potassium is stuck in the extracellular space, and if the potassium is stuck in the extracellular space, that means that the depolarization stage is longer, right? So you either shorten the absolute refractory period or you prolong the relative refractory period by giving calcium gluconate.
Doesn't the bicarb let the potassium inside the cell?
As well. We have all the adjuvant of treatment, sodium bicarbonate, we have albuterol. If you give albuterol to the patient, might also help bringing the potassium inside the cell. But the purpose of calcium gluconate and chloride is not to treat the hyperkalemia. It's to avoid arrhythmias. Put it in that way. All right? The same treatment applies for calcium channel blockers. Now we're going to talk about carbon monoxide and cyanide toxicity. Okay? So basically, even before I go through the PowerPoint, if I tell you that normally how we carry the oxygenation is by the oxygen attaching to the iron molecule at the level of the erythrocyte, which in this case will be specifically the hemoglobin. So we need to have proper amount of red blood cells, therefore proper amount of hemoglobin, therefore proper amount of iron for the oxygen molecule to be attached to it and be carried, right? If we are exposed, for example, to a fire environment, if we are exposed to the combustion of cars in a very close compartment, or any type of volatile gas in a very close compartment, we could be at risk of either cyanide toxicity or carbon monoxide toxicity. The only difference, guys, is that what's formed in carbon monoxide toxicity is the following. We normally have like, I'm not gonna ask you the level, but we normally have like maybe 3%, normal people, not smoker, normal people have like 3% of carboxyhemoglobin versus oxyhemoglobin because we don't smoke, meaning that we retain around 3% of CO2 of the inspired oxygen. You know that you breathe oxygen and you exhale CO2, right? So at least 3% of that should be expired is retained as a form of carboxyhemoglobin, all right? Of course, CO2 retainers, such as COPDers, smokers, right, they have a higher percent. So just have in mind that as pathophysiological event. When you're exposed to a fire, okay, that of course there's high levels of carbon monoxide in the environment, and you inhale that, the carboxyhemoglobin has, if I can tell you, 250% more affinity for the molecule of oxygen than the hemoglobin itself, okay? So that means that the iron molecule, which is the major receptor site for the oxygen, goes and attaches to the carbon monoxide faster than to the oxygen molecule coming from the environment. In other words, the fire, the carbon monoxide that is expelled to the outside attaches to the oxygen molecule and does not allow the oxygen from the environment to be carried by the hemoglobin, right? So what do you think is gonna happen? You can breathe? You can't breathe because you go into hypoxemia. But if you go into hypoxemia, the first thing that the patient would do not only is having low levels of SpO2, right? That's expected. But in addition to that, the patient will be tachypnic, right? Trying to look for air. And since it's not present, what's going to happen? Central cyanosis. And since the brain is not obtaining oxygen properly, patient's going to faint, having a syncopal episode, right? The body's really smart and it's going to try to put the patient flat to allow the main organ to oxygenate, which is the brain, right? But in addition to that, remember we have carboxyhemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin. The oxyhemoglobin remains free, and the oxyhemoglobin has a very bright red color. So the patient, the accumulation of oxyhemoglobin in the tissue, which in this case will be in the skin tissue, patients will take a color of cherry red, right? The same thing happens with cyanide toxicity. Same exposure, same risk factors. It's just that cyanide molecule attaches to the carboxyhemoglobin. And instead of forming carboxyhemoglobin, will form cyanocarboxyhemoglobin. But the oxyhemoglobin remains accumulated, and the patients will have exactly the same color red. They will have hypoxemia and all the consequences of hypoxemia that you should know, right? Now, what do you think would be the main treatment for this?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. 100% oxygenation. But once a patient has a syncopal episode, they can't maintain the airway, and many of them remain intubated, right? They gain the intubation, right? If you put 100% oxygenation and the patient remains conscious, there's no need. But if the patient at any point loses consciousness or has any type of major confusion hallucination, etc., or goes into a syncopal episode, you must intubate that patient and provide 100% oxygenation to try to displace the either cyanide or carbon monoxide away from the molecule of hemoglobin, all right? There's many more symptoms related to that. Now, in addition to that, we also have an antidote, actually two antidotes for cyanide toxicity. One, a precursor of vitamin B12, cyanocobalamin. So you can inject the patient vitamin B12. It's called cyanocobalamin, even though it's not here. We do it a lot in clinical practice. And thiosulfate, 25%. Okay? Is it your PowerPoint? It's coming. Thiosulfate. Okay? We don't use this very common. We use sodium thiosulfate and cyanocobalamin, which is the precursor of vitamin B12.
And use the deoxygen.
Besides the oxygen. Even though it's more specific, 100% oxygenation for carbon monoxide,
Still works for
it doesn't hurt because you're trying to displace the either cyanide or carbon monoxide away from the molecule of hemoglobin, in this case the carboxyhemoglobin. Okay? Any questions so far? We're gonna go through the PowerPoint.
Just with the vitamin B12 part, can you explain how that helps
It,
open up the?
it's a catalyst. It's just a catalyst.
So it just helps
It
with.
destroys the cyanide molecule, yes. Okay? We talked about alcohol, right? So if you have intoxication besides your fluids, besides your thiamine, multivitamin, and folic acid, which is your Raleigh pad, okay? What else can you do? So we provide actually alcohol drip to the patient in the hospital. Have you seen that? Yeah, we used to do that at Baptist. I don't know if it has gone away from it, but when I was at Baptist, ethanol drip. Have you seen that they actually provide beers to the patient? Beers?
Yeah, a while ago, I think that was.
Yes. Of course, it goes, if this is a patient that has the this is a patient. This is up-to-date information, so it's not like, the reason why we don't do it more often, it doesn't mean that it's not the actual guideline, okay? And in addition to that, of course, you always have to put the patient in antibiotics, right? 2 milligrams Q2 hours PRN in case of seizures. That's the only way you treat seizures in any condition, all right? Acute. We have all the long actings, but the first agent, first line, will be benzodiazepines all the time. And of course, once the renal function is compromised, you can either do dialysis or you could try to reverse the alcohol with fomepizole. All right? Heparin. For example, we had a patient this weekend that the patient came in with GI bleed, and it was highly confused because the patient, we never saw the actual hematemesis on the patient, was just as a history. And then once the patient, okay, how can I tell you this? Patient has a history of acute viral syndrome a week before. Family members also with a viral condition like, bronchitis. The wife works at a Dolphin Mall. The actual patient works in the aquarium, okay? And even though they're highly exposed to tourists, bringing a lot of bugs, he also will clean the pools of the aquarium. So we thought, well, besides your history of hematemesis, the hemoglobin remains stable, but he went quickly into ARDS, respiratory failure. We didn't know if it was an actual viral syndrome, we put it on Tamiflu anyways, or chemical pneumonitis from the actual Clorox that they clean the pools, etc. Anyways, the patient intubated, went up to the point of pressure control, really critical. And of course, leukocytosis, lactic acid elevated. So the sepsis protocol, we put the patient on broad spectrum antibiotics, cefepime, and vancomycin, like you know. And lactic acid, instead of coming down, it was going higher and higher, even though the patient was well vented, etc. It got to a point of a plateau. That's when I received the patient. Got to a point of a plateau. The patient was getting better. Volume control. We even had the patient at 50% and 8 of P on the ventilator. The X-ray was actually improving. But at the initial stages of admission, the patient had elevated troponins. Like, you know, at the beginning, point something, which could be the sepsis or the hypoxemic event. Then it went up to 5. The day that I went, we repeated it. It was 7, and we said, you know what? Let me continue trending. If it's going higher, then now we had a contraindication at the beginning, anyways, right? Possible hematemesis, even though we never saw it. The wife refused EGD at that time. And the reason why she refused EGD is because it was too much for her. They were doing bronchoscopies and draw lines, this and that. And she was like, no more. He's not bleeding. Leave him alone. He's critical. Okay? So we had that back in mind, like if it's bleeding or not bleeding. Stufo was positive. The hemoglobin was dropping, but that got stabilized. So, well, maybe it was a sepsis. Leave him alone. The troponins actually went to 10 and 14. So that means that we had to put the patient on heparin drip by protocol, right? EKG, non-systemic elevation, but had a depression on the inferior wall. So,
Do you do nitro drip at that point too?
no, well, the patient was hypotensive, so no. But anyways, what's the guideline? Remember, aspirin and Plavix? That's what we did, aspirin and Plavix. He was already on that anyways. Or Brilinta, right? Heparin drip, right? What do you think happened? Right. So what the questionable hematemesis that we never saw, and even the web says I don't think so, maybe he confused himself. I saw him putting some like pink, which it makes sense, pulmonary edema, right? Frothy, sputum, pink. He was in pulmonary edema when he came in, but ARDS type, non-cardiogenic. So we put him on heparin drip, and he massively bled through the Auger tube. And up and down. It wasn't even melena. It was up, hematemesis, and hematochezia. We had to stop the heparin right away, of course, and we had to reverse, right? And bring the patient stat to the EED. We had the suspicion at the beginning. It was so many things. This is a patient that is a diabetic, non-compliant, came in with a hemoglobin A1C of 15. Never took his medications, blood pressure medication, non-control, 59. But still John.
Yeah.
Still John person. So a non-compliant person, heavy smoker, I don't know how you can smoke 4 packs a day. Oh, I really cannot. Think about it, okay? It's like a chain smoker. When the pulmonologist, because I was on the case as ICU, not as pulmonary, when the pulmonologist did the bronchoscopy, he saw a questionable clot versus a tumor. And the reason why it's questionable because when you flush the airway and you aspirate, if it's a clot, it dislodges and you can suction it. But he couldn't, so he said maybe it's a tumor. So they also saw a tumor in the EGD that when we put the heparin drip. So this is basically a really bad prognosis. So my story is about heparin, right? So when you have a patient on heparin drip that is actively bleeding, you must reverse right away. Now, if you put the patient on heparin and you have to stop the heparin just because there's a procedure, you don't have to reverse. Heparin has a half-life of 90 minutes. 60 to 1 hour. I'm sorry. 1 hour to 1 hour and 15 minutes. So you can stop it at 1 hour before, and by the time the patient is prepared and taken to the OR, heparin is gone. Okay? That's the beauty that we use that anticoagulant before any kind of procedure or thinking a possibility of a procedure. But if the patient is actively bleeding, you must reverse, and the antidote is protamine sulfate. Okay? The rest, we talked about iron, that is deferoxamine, which is chelation therapy. We're not gonna talk about this, okay, they're not as common. One thing that I forgot to mention in carbon monoxide toxicity and cyanide toxicity, I don't know if you remember in pathophysiology, which I doubt, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve.
Yeah.
To the right, to the left? Okay. And if you are, if you go back and you refresh your memory, remember that this is no more than the ability or the flexibility that the hemoglobin has to get free the oxygen molecule when the tissue is in high demand of oxygen. So think about processes that you really need oxygen, and that's gonna be to the right, okay? And processes that, they're really bad, but not as to put the patient on tissue hypoxemia and ischemia and necrosis, that will be to the left. So that means that the oxygen hemoglobin, the affinity of the hemoglobin for the molecule of oxygen is decreased. Why? Because it's letting you go. It's letting go the oxygen molecule in high demand processes, like any hypoxemic event, and such as what? Hyperthermia compared to hypothermia, right? Even though hypothermia is bad, hyperthermia is worse. So fever will be worse than hypothermia, and the hemoglobin will allow the oxygen molecule to be free and go and assist the tissue, right? Acidosis versus alkalosis, right? So think about those type of events. So when the patients have carbon monoxide toxicity or cyanide toxicity, remember that either cyanide or carbon monoxide does not allow the hemoglobin to attach to the molecule of oxygen. And even though it's in high need, the tissue is in high need, the oxygen is not there. It's not attached to the receptor of the hemoglobin. Do you understand? It's already occupied. So that's the reason why the complications are worse, because it stays paralyzed in the left shift. Do you understand or not? All right.
Is that for both?
Okay. In a normal person, you and me, that haven't been exposed to a fire, just put that as an example. Normally, okay, you now have salicylate toxicity, for example, has nothing to do with the oxygen, I'm sorry, with the hemoglobin molecule, right? What do you think the tissue is gonna do? Well, the hemoglobin perceives that the tissue is going through acidosis, through hypoxemia, and the affinity decreases and lets go the oxygen to assist the tissue, right? But the oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin molecule at that time. Do you understand? The oxygen is present in the hemoglobin at the receptor site appropriately. So I say, hey, that one needs help, go and assist, right? But if you're dangling and you have no idea where to go, how can you get the signal? Do you understand? The oxygen. I'm trying to lower the level and talk as a kid so you can understand, all right? So if the oxygen is not attached to the hemoglobin molecule, in the cases of carbon monoxide toxicity, if the CO2 molecule is attached to the molecule of oxygen and not the oxygen itself, how can the oxygen realize and get the neural input that I have to go and assist? Never happens, right? So, because either cyanide or carbon monoxide has a higher affinity for the molecule of hemoglobin, and they're occupying the receptors, even if the tissue is in high demand of oxygen, it will never, the curve, meaning hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, will never be shifted to the right, and it will stay arrested at the left side. So that you might read in your book is left-sided oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. It's because it never the oxygen never will receive the input of the receptors to go and assist, okay? And that's even worse. That's the reason why you have to give 100% oxygenation to try to oxygenate that tissue and reverse that effect, okay? All right, in addition to that, remember that the patient gets a high color, red, beefy color, or like a strawberry color, okay? That's due to the high accumulation of oxyhemoglobin converting into an inorganic molecule which is called methemoglobinemia, all right? Or methemoglobin. We have seen, at least me, I have seen only 2 cases, one in Jackson and one in Kendall Regional, that when you measure not only the carbon monoxide levels on the patient, when you measure the methyl hemoglobin levels or oxyhemoglobin level or carboxyhemoglobin levels are so elevated that the only way that you can displace that, besides the oxygenation, and in the case of cyanides, besides the cyanocobalamin, which is the vitamin B12, you have to give methane blue to the patient. That same methane blue that you used in, I don't know, at least in Cuba, to enhance the white brightness of the clothes, that one. Of course, more chemically prepared in laboratory, right? To be infused by paint.
No, they get a flash or something like that.
Okay? So, rare, but we have used it, at least in my experience, 2 times I've seen it, all right? And we have gone through at least organophosphate and tricyclic acid. Now, what is sandostatin? What is octreotide?
For
Organophosphonalurea. What is octreotide?
vasoconstrictor.
That's the one that we use for JP.
What is it?
It vasoconstricts.
Why does it vasoconstrict?
Because it works on the peripheral nervous system.
It's actually a growth hormone.
It's a hormone.
It's a growth hormone that acts on the level of the pituitary as a GnRH in the hypothalamus, and growth hormone or GnH at the level of the hypophysis, but at the level of the GI tract produces vasoconstriction. So besides putting a patient on Protonix drip, if the patient has the history of liver cirrhosis and there's a possibility of esophageoviruses, you can also add to the treatment sandostatin, which is octreotide, which is a growth hormone that inhibits not only the vasodilatory effect of esophageoviruses, right, but produces major vasoconstriction of the plaque circulation, in this case, the GI tract, okay? So we talked about this, ways of elimination, as well as this. So in every single patient that arrives to the ER or any urgent care that has altered mental status, you have to do toxicology. You have to, okay? And we have treated patients that I don't know if it was collected or has forgotten, but we have received patients in the ICU, not the majority. The majority do have toxicology, but there's few cases that escape and they don't do it. I don't know why. And then it will be too late, right? Because it will be gone from the system. So we talked about all this already, alcohol toxicity, right? So again, I mean, you go through alcohol or any type of toxic drug. We said that, again, the patients go into high iron gamma metabolic acidosis due to lactic acidosis, right? Because all these toxic drugs are affecting the mitochondria and cellular respiration. Not only the energy is affected, right, by the actual potential and the Krebs cycle, but in addition to that, what's going to happen to the cell? Ischemia, right? And therefore, patients can go into, major dearrangements of electrolytes, etc. So anaerobic cascade, lactic acidemia, therefore metabolic acidosis, okay? And we're gonna talk about a smaller gap when we talk about acid base, because otherwise I will be talking in Chinese. So again, how do you treat a patient? Well, alcohol, okay, the actual methanol, not only because it goes through anaerobic metabolism, consuming high levels of carbohydrates in the Krebs cycle, but the methanol molecule itself degrades the glucose and the glycogen, right, at the level of the liver. So therefore, patients, remember, don't trust the fact that the patients are normal glucose level. Give glucose, give glucose. You can later give insulin to the patients if they become hyperglycemic. But the worst is that you will actually miss the glucose level dropping, okay? So we talked about the actual antidote, and of course, if the renal function is affected, you can expedite by hemodialysis, all right? Now, talking about, this is common sense. If you give a patient a hypoglycemic oral medication, and the patients, for example, the majority, what happens, first of all, the patients that have glyburide on board, for example, what's the most common side effect of any hypoglycemic medications? Hypoglycemia, right? Hypoglycemia. But on top of that, the patients, again, having any type of, what's another possibility? You learn and you memorize, right, in pharmacology that not only the sulfonylureas, such as glyburide is one example, give you hypoglycemia, you have to be attentive to that. But in addition to that, patients with metformin, they have two major side effects. Lactic acidosis, and what's another one that you have to keep in mind?
Low B12 or B6.
Yeah, but that's even,
Don't they have GI?
well, they have a lot of diarrhea and a lot of gastroenteritis. But in addition to that, always remember that this is a medication that cannot be in place in a patient that will go to any radio contrast studies, right? You must discontinue and put the patient on insulin, right? Because they might go into renal failure because of that, okay? And of course, all the signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia that you have in there. And we already talked in the table of antidotes that the major antidote for hypoglycemic toxicity or overdose would be your sandostatin, because it's a growth hormone, and if you think about it, if you give either growth hormone or cortisol, what's the side effect of that? Hyperglycemia. Now, but what else can you do? Simple as giving glucagon to the patient, right? Remember, you have in the pancreas alpha and beta, right? So you can give glucagon and the glucose increases as well. You don't remember that is your sandostatin. So this is just gonna go now over and over into cyanide toxicity and carbon monoxide toxicity that I already explained, okay? So as I say, once you're exposed to fire or any combustion in an enclosed area, never sleep in a car, in a very closed compartment. Open your windows or sleep outside, okay? Better. So basically the most common is you become somnolent, right? So your mental status is depressed, and at that point, actually you are presented even more commonly respiratory acidosis with metabolic acidosis, because your obtundation retains CO2, okay? Now, where else or how else can I get cyanide toxicity? Do you remember, do you memorize that even though patients with hypertensive emergencies, one of the treatments is nitroprusside, and even though some institutions still use it, we're trying to go away more and more from it, not only because we have to cover the bag, right, to allow not being exposed to the line, but in addition to that, to the possibility of cyanide toxicity, You only memorize that, so this is the time to apply it. So if a patient was in nitroprusside as a drip for hypertensive emergency, that could be one possibility, okay? And consuming a lot of fruits that have some molecules of cyanide, but you would have to eat a lot to be toxic, or having a liver impairment. As I said, basically what happens is that the entire Krebs cycle gets disrupted, right? And how do you reverse? Cyanocobalamin, even though you can put the patient on oxygen 100%, but if you have the antidote, use it. So precursor of vitamin B12, cyanocobalamin. And again, as I said, what else can you use, which is more common in clinical practice? The vitamin B12 and the thiosulfate. No, either or. All right? Another toxicity, I didn't remember what was here. Propofol infusion syndrome. When the patients are on propofol for a long time, you know that when the patients are on propofol, the majority, not everyone, because you might intubate the patient just to protect your airway and you might extubate the patient the next day, right? But if you're on propofol for a long time, the majority of these patients, when they come to the ICU, they have gone through a derangement of problems, including hypovolemia, right? And if the patient is in hypovolemic shock, you remember that the body doesn't consider the GI tract or the kidney as important. So they deviate the blood supply to the main organs, leaving the liver, which is part of the intestinal or splanchnic part of the body, completely without volume, going through what's called liver shock, because it's an ischemic, temporary ischemic process, and because the propofol cannot be metabolized properly, starts to accumulate, and the patients not only have a green color on the urine, and they might have LFTs elevated, but in addition to that, they might go into rhabdomyolysis and renal failure. Basically, it's away. Okay? IV fluids, try to flush it out. First, discontinue, right? IV fluids to try to flush it out, and basically, if you, try to treat as general, but in reality, neither naloxone, neither glucose, neither thiamine is an antidote for that. So the best indication to treat propofol overdose or syndrome is to basically discontinue the propofol and try to flush that out. Cases, 40-year-old unconscious woman brought to the hospital convulsing, has an odor garlic on her breath. She's incontinent for urine and stool. On exam, she has a temperature of 99, heart rate is 50, respiratory rate is 24, and the blood pressure is 146/88. Skin diaphoretic, she's drooling, pupils are constricted, lungs diffuse, wheezing. So going through all the toxidromes that we have discussed, if we have here a patient convulsing, first of all, I'm saying that this is the patient that has altered mental status, right? So the mental state is compromised already. One, would I give charcoal?
No.
Gastric decompression? No. I have to intubate this patient. Of course, the patient is convulsing, I have to treat that. First of all, Ativan, right? You give 2 milligrams stat, and every 2 minutes, if it's necessary, all right? Now, let's put aside the garlic odor breath, and now you have bradycardia. From all the toxidromes that we have gone through, tell me the possibilities. Let's start from the beginning. Wait. Let's start from the beginning of the PowerPoint, right? Cholinergic agonist, muscarinic, that gives you everything slow, everything wet, and everything constricted.
Alcohol,
Yes. Wait, one by one. If this is it, if this is cholinergic agonist, how are we gonna reverse? Anticholinergic, what are you giving?
Atropine.
Okay?
There's another one.
Right, this is the
Proximity.
Then, that means that it cannot be anticholinergic, right? Could it it be opioid?
Opiate. Because the
Why not?
pupils are.
Wait. I'm bradycardic. Could it be sleeping?
The respiratory, it's too fast.
Wait, let's analyze everything. We're only up to the point of bradycardia, right? Due to bradycardia, could it be opioid?
Yes.
Of course. Could it be benzo overdose? Of course. And I'm very sleepy, right? And even with seizures. Just concentrate on mental status and bradycardia so far. Yes. Could it be the contrary, which is antidepressants, which you have a lot of norepinephrine and serotonin? Serotonin syndrome? No.
Is it harder than
It's the opposite. Could it be sympathomimetic agonist? No, you're too high. Right? Could it be beta blocker? Yes. Now, I'm not mentioning any space that the patient was exposed to fire, or so could it be cyanide or no, right? Could it be salicylate toxicity or Tylenol toxicity?
No.
Keep reading. We haven't read anything about finding bottles or being on pain or the patient is breathing fast or nothing like that, right? Or tinnitus, whatever, how do you say it? Tinnitus. Okay. Let's keep analyzing. Oh, incontinent urine and stool because your mental status is compromised. You have bradycardia, a little bit high. Diaphoretic, sweating.
Could be sugar. And the heart will be.
Yeah, it could be sugar, but I have to give you more information. Let's see what's coming after. But so far, I have bradycardia, and I have diaphoresis. Everything slow, everything wet. And my pupils have to be constricted in order to be a cholinergic agonist. That's how you have to analyze on the test. And I gave you 20 questions to practice. If you want to give you more, I don't care.
Are you gonna use it? There's also organic.
So, it is cholinergic poisoning. So that's how you have to break it down, okay? Now, can I give gastric decompression and charcoal before I secure that airway?
No.
No. Patient seizures, right? I have to intubate the patient, and then you can do whatever you want, right? And of course, I would treat the seizures as well with Ativan, as we say, and we can give atropine or, we have bradycardia, right? Give atropine, even if it's symptomatic or not symptomatic, well, the patient is even more than symptomatic, but, all right? And pradigoxine, all right? 17-year-old male presents to the hospital with somnolence, slurred speech, ultramental status, okay? Younger sister said that he showed her a handful small seeds that she was going to take. So at least you saw something in her hands. Temperature is high, heart rate is high. So the patient has tachycardia and hyperthermia. Skin is warm and dry. It's the opposite. Do you understand? So let's analyze. Again, could it be cholinergic agonist, that everything's slow and wet and contracted? No. Could it be anti-cholinergic, that everything's fast and everything's dry and I'm dry?
Yes.
Now let's continue. Even though my patient is somnolent, if you're really sleeping, guys, you're not going to be tachycardic. And there's no reason why you should have a temperature of 100 when you're sleeping.
It says somnolence by chromatic.
Right. Do you understand? So, could it be benzos or opioids? No. And when you're sleepy, your pupils are constricted or dilated.
I don't know.
Well, look at your patient. Look at your patient or your wife or your daughter or your son. Okay? So, let's continue. Let's continue. Could it be salicylate toxicity of liver? I would have to tell you, even though the seeds are there, and I have no idea if it was seeds or pills, I have to tell you more about it, like liver function. Do you understand nausea, vomiting, tinnitus for salicylate toxicity, things like that, right? Or metabolic acidosis. Even though these patients would have also metabolic acidosis, it's not the most common presentation. The symptoms that appear first are this, the dryness, the tachycardia, etc. Could it be sympathomimetic agonist? Amphetamines, I'm tachycardic, and I'm dilated, right? But it's not gonna be in the same option. I can't do that. Nobody can do that. Can't be TCAs, toxicity, or SSRIs, toxicity, because because the patients are tachycardic and dilated pupils and warm skin as well. But it cannot be in the same choice as an answer. Do you understand? Good. So it cannot be beta blocker because I'm tachycardic, I'm not bradycardic. That's how you have to rationalize. So how are you gonna treat anticholinergic toxicity? Give me the acetylcholine. How do you do that? Give me acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Give me the physostigmine. This is a patient unresponsive. His friend accompanies him and states that he took a handful of pills because he was in pain. If you're in pain, what do you most likely take? Opioids or Tylenol or NSAIDs. So I have three possibilities. I'm opioid overdose, I'm salicylate toxicity, or I am Tylenol toxicity, right? Okay, on exams, you're bradycardic, respiratory is 6, and hypotensive. Why? Because if you come in Tylenol toxicity or salicylate toxicity, until you lose consciousness. But you don't come with loss of consciousness from the beginning, and you have more jaundice, and you have more features related to liver damage, right? So Narcan. So we talked about this, the entire explanation, I'm not gonna go over again. Any questions?
Exam is easier or 50 questions?
The more the better, let's see how much I can come up with. So, after the break, I'm gonna start IV fluids, all right? And I can send you more questions to practice. Guys, you need to practice. Yeah. You need to practice. I was really concerned about the fact that I went over salicylate toxicity last Tuesday, and my students were not prepared for simulation. Do you understand? So it's not a matter of who were there, it's the case of the entire classroom. You need to study. You need to study, okay? All right? I wish we could have more time to apply all this, but it's only 3 to 4 hours.
The infections that are coming in, we that's the no longer hospitalized, but I know we don't.
¿Cuándo ustedes vienen a
And I said clear.
¿Cuándo es el de ustedes? ¿Cuándo lo
But
ponen?
it's coming.
¿Por qué día?
All right, so you can take a break, and I will start fluid and electrolyte. Until 3 p.m. Divided by 2.8. 25 plus 540 divided by 18. 30. So that means that 292 plus 25 plus 30 equals 347. Do you remember the normal value of serum osmolarity?
Up to 300.
Remember that depending on the book that you read, it's 276 to 282 or 280 to 296. So we got into an agreement, right, before that because of the variability, 280 up to 300. So, and it's high osmolarity, right? Okay, just so far so good. You need to know that. if you have a high osmolarity, who controls osmolarity? Sodium, right? So that means that if the sodium is high, the osmolarity should, no must, should be high, right? So whenever you have elevated osmolarity, you think about sodium being high too, right? Because again, osmolarity is no more than the ratio proportion of these two, right? And it's a dry erase. So that means that the sodium is elevated in the extracellular space. And if you remember pathophysiology again, you have two movements that are called diffusion and osmosis, right? So that means that diffusion is the solute that move from higher concentration to lower concentration. That means from the extracellular space to the intracellular space. But if you have a lot of solutes here, that means that you have a little bit of water, right? So by osmosis, which is the movement of water from the higher compartment to the lower compartment, the movement of water by osmosis is going to move backwards. So the cell will shrink, right? And that's the purpose, for example, when you give a patient mannitol that increases serum osmolarity, or when you give a patient 3% saline that increases sodium level and therefore osmolarity, you're trying to bring water out of the cell to decrease cerebral edema, okay? Another practice. Let me see if this one works better. 140, so 2 times 140 plus BUN is 40 divided by 2.8 plus glucose 180 divided by 18. I'm sure the number is after that, so I'll calculate it for no reason, but remember, multiplication and division first, then addition, otherwise you get a different number. So the number's not there, so let's do it. 2 times 4, 2 times 140? 280. Plus 40 divided by 2.8.
14.2.
14.2.
And 180 divided by 18?
10.
10, right? So this is going to be 24.2. 304.2. So it's still elevated, right? It's over 300. So the movement is going to be the same. Here is when the content becomes a little bit more complicated. Okay? So, if you remember again, pathophysiology, which I shouldn't even go through this because otherwise that will never end. Okay? Normally remember that you have your prerenal arteriole and postrenal arteriole. You have your nephron, right? Which the more proximal the tubule is located at the kidney, the more excretion of electrolytes and less water, right? In the proximal tubule, you expel a lot of sodium bicarbonate and potassium and sodium and chloride. And as you advance, you expel more water and you conserve electrolyte. That's the reason why in the distal and convolute you have the aldactone, which is spirolactone, that basically will conserve potassium because it's now aldosterone antagonist. That's exactly what it says here. Now, in addition to that, remember that not only we have in the prerenal arteriole, do you remember this? That we have the angiotensin converted enzyme, and the postrenal arteriole we have prostaglandin, that at any point and for no reason, I explained in renal, that you will give ACE inhibitors or prostaglandin inhibitors when the patients are in acute renal failure, pre-renal, you'd say no? I remember yes. No.
We shouldn't give it.
Okay?
We shouldn't give it.
All right. And remember that as we advance in the tubules, we have at the level of the proximal tubule aldosterone, that the function of aldosterone is reabsorption of sodium and water. and excretion of potassium, right? And as you advance even further, we have anti-diuretic hormone, which basically allows reabsorption of water only and no electrolytes. And this mechanism participate in autoregulation, right? Remember that whenever there is low volume and low pressure, not only the body sends a response to the beta receptors and chemoreceptors located at the level of the hypothalamus and beta receptors located at the level of the right atrium and carotid arch, right? Yes. That those perceive pressure and volume and sense a signal to release catecholamines for vasoconstriction to improve volume and pressure. And if that doesn't work, renin is released at the level of the juxtaglomerular apparatus, right? To allow angiotensin 1 to be released, right? And the conversion to angiotensin 2, if the vasoconstrictive effect of angiotensin 1 doesn't happen. And if that is not effective, then we have the release of aldosterone, right? To reabsorb volume, which is water, followed by sodium. And in exchange, because those electrolytes have to exchange at the level of the membrane, excrete potassium. And if that doesn't improve the volume or pressure, then we have at the end vasopressin, which is anti-diuretic hormone, to improve the conservation of water. You know that, so even though here it is, and here it is. All right? And we talked about the entire function of our anti-diuretic hormone, okay? So the entire autoregulatory mechanism that you should know already. Now, how do we get water and lose water? Okay, so first of all, we get water not only by drinking hypotonic water, right, from the faucet or your bottles, but in addition to that, through the food. We have a percentage of water in the food, okay? In addition to that, how do we lose water? You have to have in mind that we can lose water only by insensitive respiration. So a patient that is breathing, if you're alive, you're breathing, you're already losing volume through the breathing process. If you're on a ventilator, you're actually losing volume as well. Perspiration, urination and defecation, and the entire catabolic state produces losses of water as well. This is basically the autoregulatory response that I explained. So have in mind that we don't only lose water by having polyuria and diarrhea, okay? So what would be the most common causes of hypovolemia? So if you have profuse sweating, you can be hypovolemic, right? If you have hemorrhagic states, you can be hypovolemic. Diarrhea and vomiting, those are causes of extra-renal losses of water, okay? So think about why the patient came in, all right? Renal sodium and water losses, diuretics, right? Those are the most common causes of loss of water. When you have, for example, third space patients, that the volume in the vascular space is contracted, when the patients have cardiomyopathies and valvulopathies that we have discussed, having a decreased cardiac output decreases the amount of volume that goes into the right atrial preload, right? Or venous return. Therefore, the tissue is compromised, being perceived that volume contracted or hypovolemia. And in sepsis, when there's a major vasodilatory state or anaphylactic patients that are major vasodilatory state, there's major redistribution of fluid into the third space as well, which is the interstitium, leaving the vascular space contracted, okay? So again, this is what I just said. How do you get fluid in? How do you get fluid out? Okay? I'm not gonna ask you these numbers, but I want you to have in mind that we normally tend to ingest at least 500 mLs of water, and that excluding the food, okay? 800, that could be content in the food, and through the oxidation of the metabolism, we also can gain 300, But we do also have an obligatory loss that if we sweat 500, at least minimum 500 of urine, breathing, so insensitive losses, and even stools. As you can see, we should be always in equal balance, right? Which is called auto-regulation or homeostasis. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way. Up to here, so far, osmolarity, you must calculate that in your exam, okay? So you must memorize the formula. I'm not gonna let you use it. Now, the fluids types, all right? I don't know, there's more formulas that you have to know. Plenty in acid-base imbalance. So, types of fluids. Well, you know that by pathophysiology, we have isotonic fluids, right? That isotonicity means that the fluid allows the movement of water and electrolytes equally among compartments. Examples of that, you have normal saline and lactated Ringer, right? Those are the two most common that are used in patients that have hypovolemia. The major reason why we're tending to use more LR is because it mimics very, very perfectly the plasma. So mostly in patients that are in OR during surgery, we tend to use more LR, even though in the ICU, we're using it a lot, okay? Just pay attention. I'm not gonna make you memorize the numbers, but just look at it. Just take a look at it. Lactated Ringer, remember that your normal values of sodium were 135 to 145, so it's highly close to a normal value, okay? Comparing with normal saline that has 154 milliequivalents of sodium, even though maintains isotonicity. Normal saline does not have potassium unless you add the potassium to the fluid, all right? But LR already has 4 milliequivalents of potassium. So that's why we tend to use it more and more in the ICU. They have, the same amount of sodium as chloride because it makes sense, they go together, right? As you can see, lactated Ringer has bicarbonate. So the patients in the ICU critically ill, the majority have electrolyte imbalances, the majority have metabolic acidosis. So you're basically buffering that patient constantly and providing the loss of electrolytes if you use LR more than using NS, okay? So it's actually better. NS, as you can see, has no dextrose whatsoever. That LR does have 50 milliequivalents of dextrose, which again is the beauty because the majority of critically ill patients at the beginning, due to the compensatory state of high levels of cortisol, they go into hyperglycemia, but then later on, due to the major dearrangement, you're using insulin and the patients go up and down. So to avoid that, you have already 50 milliequivalents. Now, those are the isotonics. Then we have hypotonic solutions that many come in to the extracellular space as hypotonic, and then once they enter the cell, they convert into hypertonic, okay? And as you would see that examples of those are D5 normal saline is an example of that because it has the same amount of sodium as normal saline, okay? And only 50 milliequivalents. So just because having hypertonic substance right here and the same milliequivalents of normal saline, it enters as hypotonic but then converts into hypertonic once it's inside the cell, okay? Now, other types of fluid are called hypotonic, okay? And I'll explain the shift again in a second. Hypotonic solutions are D5 water, or even the tap water that you put on the patient with the 82 with the flushes. Those are hypotonic substances. Half normal saline, a quarter of normal saline, and that's it. Okay, so what happens when you have, if you recall patho again, or not. if you have a patient that you're giving an isotonic solution, makes sense, right? Beautifully equal compartments, no problem. We already explained that if you give a hypertonic substance or having increased the osmolarity, that would be, for example, 3% saline. If you give 2% saline or 3% saline to a patient, that means that the amount of sodium in the extracellular space will be high, right? And what's gonna happen? By diffusion goes in, but by osmosis goes out, so the cell shrinks, right? So that's the purpose of your 3% saline, your mannitol, your 2%, etc. Okay? But we also have another group of fluid that is called hypotonic fluid that does completely the opposite. If you have your sodium level decrease in the extracellular compartment by giving me half normal saline, a quarter of normal saline, or D5W, what's going to happen is that the sodium level decreases. Therefore, by diffusion, since the solute goes from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, the solutes will go out, right? But the water, by osmosis, if I have a little bit of sodium, I have a lot of water, so the water will go inside the cell and the cell will swell. So that means that hypotonic substances are completely contraindicated, absolutely contraindicated in patients that have brain edema. Okay? Or patients that are at risk of brain edema. So avoid that in any stroke patient. Now, what would be the purpose of giving hypotonic solution? Hypernatremia. But you would see that not all the patients that have hypernatremia, which is an error in clinical practice, you must give first hypotonic fluids. Because one cause of hypernatremia is dehydration. Okay, we're gonna go there.
So, wait, if they're hypernatremia, you give hypotonic.
But I'm not all the time.
Right, because they could be
Because of the other
Because they could be
You
dehydrated.
first fix the door.
Right? So this is exactly what I explained here. Even though these substances are hypotonic, once they enter the cell, they become hypertonic. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Okay, they are in classification hypotonic, but when they enter the cell, they become hypertonic. Got it? Hypertonic per se, as they enter the extracellular space, 3% saline, 2% saline, mannitol. Okay? Isotonic solutions, we said, LR and NS, and hypotonic solution, D5W, a quarter of normal saline, and half normal saline. Now, where will you indicate hypotonic solution? For example, we said already in a patient with hypernatremia, but again, don't take it as 100% indication, because we have gone in the past through the algorithm of hypo and hypernatremia, and you know that if you're dehydrated, you could either be hypo or hyper. So why start with a why start with a hypotonic substance if you see signs and symptoms of dehydration on the patient? You need to bring that fluid inside of the cell, right? And hydrate the cell. So give an isotonic first as a challenge. If that is the case of dehydration. If the sodium starts to come down, there's no need to give hypotonic substance, okay? Do you understand? But if the next day the labs are worse, it makes sense that you start with a hypotonic the next day, okay? Now, in addition, when do you also give D5W, guys? You have a patient on MPO, if you have no plan to start feeding, you have to give glucose at some source, because that's our main source, main source of nutrition, right? You can give D5Ws on patients that have hypoglycemia, but you know that the best is to basically give an amp, right, of of dextrose, or if the patient remains hyponatremic, you can start D10 instead, okay? To mix it with many drugs, we mix D5W with Leofed, with amiodarone, with many other drugs. Now, I'm not gonna go there because we're gonna actually discuss SIADH, okay? And when do you give sodium chloride? Well, we explained it, right? Patients dehydrated, they're volume contracted. LR, same indications as normal saline. To treat hyponatremia in a patient that is asymptomatic, okay? Patients that are in metabolic alkalosis, you will see an acid-base imbalance that we have two types, chloride responsive and non-chloride responsive, and the chloride responsive are dehydrated patients, so of course you have to give sodium chloride or LR in any patient that has shock, right? Hypovolemic and distributed shock, those are indications as well. And of course, we have to avoid overloading the patients in patients that have, for example, CHF, cirrhosis of the liver, etc. And we kind of discussed as well the hypotonic solutions, right? So other fluids that we have discussed, that we use, in clinical practice, albumin or heparin. We are kind of like going away from the heparin. This is basically a hyperconcentrated substance. You know that albumin is a protein, right? So basically what you're doing is increasing the colloidal osmotic pressure of the patient. Majority of the patients that are either lacking albumin, and the majority are, right? Majority of our patients are in catabolic state. Just come inside the hospital and your albumin will be low, okay? Any disease process goes into catabolism, therefore breaking down proteins, and the albumin will be low. So if you have this patient with low albumin and in thirst phase, instead of giving isotonic solution, you can give albumin, right? And the same apply for heparin, that even though we don't use it more so often, right? Now what else can you give? Of course, it makes sense that if my patient was bleeding through the NG tube after I put heparin, right? Besides reversing with protamine sulfate, I have to type across and transfuse the patient, right? Because remember, the hemoglobin is not going to be seen abnormal right away. The bone marrow has to react to that, and then maybe in 1 hour or so, you might see the hemoglobin of 5. But you have to transfuse if you see massive amounts of active bleeding. All right? So the only thing that I want you to have in mind is that there's two types of albumin, 5% and 25%. The 5% are small bottles, right? Tiny. So you don't add much of volume to the patient. The 25%, 25% the small bottles, and the 5% are the big bottles. So just have in mind that by you giving, listen to this, by you giving the 5%, which is 250 mLs of albumin, you're giving that patient 4 liters of NS equivalent. So be careful. Be careful. Because sometimes it's highly confused at the beginning when you don't have experience. And if you don't know exactly what to order, ask. So 25% albumin, tiny bottle. So you're giving pure protein and small volume. Okay? The renal patients, for example.
Dialysis.
Exactly. Or the patients are in pulmonary edema, that you only want to add the albumin to improve the colloidal osmotic pressure, but you don't want to add extra volume to the patient. Don't use the big bottles. Only if it's for volume expansion that the patient is in shock and you don't want to give fluids, right? You just want to give large amount of volume based on albumin. Do you understand? In that case, the patient is in shock, you can give albumin 250 mL, which is the 5%. So, in other words, the smaller the number, the bigger the bottle. Yes.
Don't they come in 4.5 and 25?
And 25, higher concentration, but not the volume.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, the first, okay.
50 mL and 100.
Okay, there's albumin, 25%
Okay? And the albumin 25% comes in 12.5 grams and 25 grams. Okay? Then the albumin 5% that comes in 12.5 grams and 25 grams. This is the concentration of the protein, but this is the volume. As you can see, it has only 5% of protein and the rest is volume. And here are 25% of protein and the rest is volume. Okay? So have that in mind. That if you're giving the big bottle, you're giving 4 liters equivalent of big bottle. What I do, which is the best, you get the 25% of albumin, either 12.5 or 20, doesn't matter, but that's just tiny, tiny bottle, to a CHF patient. Compared to 5%, doesn't matter the concentration that you choose. I always start with a 12.5 because why put the patient and have proteinemia, right? Start with a 12.5 grams on a patient that's in shock. Okay, that you don't want to give a normal saline or LR. Okay? Now, who do you give maintenance? Well, we have 2 ways of infusing volume to the patient. One, patients in shock. We already know that any patient that is hypotensive or hypovolemic, you give a bolus of 30 mLs per kilo. And then you start maintenance therapy. Right? And who really needs maintenance therapy? Or up to what time you continue maintenance therapy? Well, one, patients remains embryo. Are you gonna give the amount of fluid that the cell needs, and the nutrition and the electrolytes, right? I'm talking in general of fluids, okay? And second of all, the patient is eating, but the patient remains in pre-renal renal failure, right? Makes sense that you continue the adding fluids at that point. So losing, just having in mind, how do you lose isotonic volume? I'm not gonna ask you like that yet. The type of fluids, yes. Like for example, when you bleed, you basically lose isotonic fluid. When you have diarrhea and vomiting, you lose isotonic. Why? Because you lose water and the same amount of electrolytes with it. Let me compare to you. Having diarrhea, let me compare this. Having polyuria from the second phase of renal failure is isotonic compared to the polyuria of diabetes insipidus. Do you understand? Yeah. Because diabetes insipidus, either central or nephrogenic, you urinate hypotonic urine, no electrolytes. Remember, you're lacking ADH, right? So if you lack ADH, there's no reabsorption of water, there's loss of water. But water only, no electrolytes. When you lose volume on the second stage of polyuric renal failure, you lose both water and electrolytes. Do you understand? Okay. The same as alcohol. When you drink a lot of alcohol, beer and margaritas or whatever, right? Any type of alcohol is an inhibitor of the ADH. So you see yourself going to the bathroom constantly, and at the beginning the urine might be yellow, but then after that it's crystal clear because you're inhibiting ADH. You stay with the electrolytes, but then you lose the water. Okay?
But that'll be isotonic as well.
I'm not going to ask you that. I'm going to ask you the types of fluid and when to use it. Okay? Now, let's calculate maintenance. There's many ways of calculating the maintenance. I'm going to make you aware of the more complicated way of it, and then you're going to learn the easy way. Okay? So, yes. Okay.
we have a formula that's called holiday cigar method, okay? Basically it says that in a 24-hour, okay, period, you have to give a patient a certain percent of fluid based on their kilogram, okay? So, based on losses as well, right? Remember that we kind of like intake and output at least 1.6, right? Wasn't it like 1,600? So more or less 1.5, 1.6, right? And that actually applies for a 70 kilogram patient. And the reason why they come up like that is because they said that coming from pediatric patient to adulthood, all right? If you are between or less than, depending on how where you read it, less than 10 kilograms, you need 100 milligrams per kilo. So that means that if you're in the first step, imagine that, let me break it down like this, 70 kilograms. You're 70 kilograms. Tell me how many kilograms are in a 70 kilograms. If I break down into the first 10, the second 20, and the last 20. So that means that I have here 30, right? And if I have here 30, how many do I need for 40? Sorry, for 70, 40 more, right? So at least in the first 30 kilograms, I need here 100. And as you can see in the second, I need here, do you see that? 1,000, okay? And more than 20 kilograms, what do I need? Up to what we calculated at the beginning, input and output, which is 1,500, right? And then you divide that by 24 hours, and that's gonna give you the breakdown of hourly rate, all right? So let's do an example. So in other words, erase again. The same thing is said by this author, broken down is, again, you have a patient. I'm gonna give you a kilogram, certain number of kilograms, right? The first 10, you need 100, okay? For the second 10, which is again 20, yes or no? So less than 20, so 10 and 10, okay? You need 50 mLs per kilo, which is no more than, again, 1,000. So far, so good? Okay. And then each additional kilogram, more than 20 kilograms, so this means that you have 20 here, right? Yes or no? So since you have 20 here, any additional, which here was 40, do you understand?
Yes.
Okay. All right. You're gonna calculate 20 mLs per kilo. So in reality, guys, you have in a 70 kilograms, you know that you have 1,500, right? But Holiday Cigar says that any excess after that, you calculate 20 mLs per kilo. So imagine that I'm 82. You know that by 70, you have already 1,500. So you have an extra 12. $240 more, right? 240 more. So you add that to 240 more, and you have 1,740 divided by 24 hours, and you get your hourly rate. That's one way of doing it. No, yes, it's the hard way. For example, here again is the 70 kilograms, so it's really easy, right? But if we get the calculation of a higher kilogram, which is not there, this is the way I told you. You get the excess of, again, remember you have 10, 10, and over 20, which is this, you calculate the excess. So we have, again, 1,500 for 70 kilograms. I have 12 more. 12 times 20 give you the excess. That's one way. And easier is coming now, and even easier later. All right? So, but I have to make you aware of the holistic bar calculation. Now, another way is to say again that 4-2-1 rule has to apply to that. Very closely. It's not an exact number, but very closely, okay? So, that means that you will do 40 mLs per kilo per hour for the first 10 kilograms. Listen, 70 is divided into, for the first 10, do you see that? 40 mLs per kilo per hour for the first 10 is 40. So that means that for my first 10, I already have 40, this is to calculate per hour, and avoid the division by 24 hours. 40 mLs, okay? I have then, again, 4-2-1 rule. 2 mLs per kilo for the next 10. So for the next 10, I have 20 mLs, right? Yes or no? So, but I only have 20 here so far. I have 70 kilograms, so that means that I'm missing 50. Yes? So, for the rest, after the 20, I'm gonna do 1 ml per kilo per hour. So that means that 50. So that means that I have 60 plus 5, 110. That's gonna be 110 ml per hour. Like you never put the patient on 110 ml per hour, 100 ml per hour. This is easier to remember. But there's one coming easier than that. Which is, it's not in the PowerPoint, but it's basically you take the kilograms of the patient and you add 40, and it's going to give you that. 7, well, just add 40. So if you add 40, how much is 70 plus 40? That's it. That's it. So the first guy was like, had no life. I understand that math is not our strength, right? So I have to come out with orders.
Why did 40 explain the last one? Why did 40?
The last one, how much do you weigh? In kilograms, just invent a number. Kilograms. 52 kilograms times 40.
Plus 40.
No, not multiplication, no multiplication. Add, addition. Plus 40. So again, you're not going to put it in an awkward number like 90 mLs per hour. You're not going to do 92 mLs per hour. You just put 100. But at least you have an approximation. Now the one that's going to give you an exact number is the holiday cigar equation.
So that's the one that's in the
Plus 40 is fine.
Plus 40 and that works for the board?
Yes.
Plus 40 is for the board.
I already forgot the first one.
So that's your maintenance fluid. But it's not only the calculation of it, it's you need to choose the right fluid. That's what the board is concerned the most. Not the ratio. Yes.
So the 421 and the holiday one is just to give us the history and background.
Correct.
So we're,
But as you can see, the most modern form of the holiday cigar, the 4-to-1 rule, is completely exactly as at 40 to the kilograms. That's the modern, Americanized way. All right? Now, in addition, guys, you not only give fluids to the patient, right? You need to make sure that you know, even though I'm not going to make you calculate the electrolyte deficit, not at all, you can scratch this, but you have to be aware that not only we lose fluid, but we also lose electrolytes, right? And in reality, it's not only just like, okay, let me look at the potassium, if it's less than 3.4, then let me just give 20 milliequivalents of, no, it doesn't work that way, okay? I'm not sure if you know, I'm not gonna make you do this, but I'm not sure if you know that for every 10 milliequivalents of potassium that you give, the potassium goes up only 0.14. Okay? So you need to be aware of this, the higher the daily maintenance requirement.
That would be
Makes
what,
sense.
that number will be what you have to replace, not what you use for that.
Okay? Now, this is a question of board. For some reason, and I don't know why, but this comes every single year. Basically, it really depends on if the patient has mild losses, for example, if the patient has sweating or insensible respiration, that would be mild losses of volume, okay? And that's categorized as losing 30 to 50 mLs per kilo, okay? If the patient now, for example, has bleeding, but it's just maybe like 2 hematemesis and stopped, or the patient was vomiting, or the patient has C. diff, that yes, it's dehydrated, but not into chalk. So think about advanced stages of dehydration in moderate, but not to the point of chalk, okay? And mild will be basically the profuse sweating, or maybe that the patient comes with a BUN of like 24, okay? So those will be mild. Or the patient is on the ventilator, so you know that they lose, you understand, but it's not in perception. So that would be mild, 30 to 50 mLs per kilo. Moderate, 60 to 100 mLs per kilo of losses. And severe is the patient that is in shock, okay? And they basically lose more than 100 mLs per kilo. You need to know this because it's coming on board. And we already discussed that every patient that is in hypovolemia or hypotension, you must give a volume of fluid as a bolus of 30 ml per kilo, okay?
What is that, like, half the deficit?
Well, basically, what you do is, remember when you calculate the entire formula, that we decided that you were going to have 110 mLs per kilo, okay? From the total amount, okay, you will give half of the deficit, for example. Imagine that your total deficit of fluid would be, we decided that the first patient in the holiday cigar, right? The holiday cigar was 1740. You remember that we had a 240 extra? So the 1740, you're gonna get half of that, which basically is like 600, maybe 6.5, okay? And you're gonna give it as a bonus. Still on the 30 mLs per kilo, so if you do 30 mLs per kilo of, so 30 mLs per, imagine that I'm 72, well, let's put 70. 21, so 2,100, right? You could either, from this amount, the total amount, get half of that. We give it anyways in clinical practice, right? But after that, you know that even though the patient you give the bolus of 2,000, meaning 2 liters, okay, you can still have a deficit of 1,000, okay, that you continue giving as a bolus. Many patients don't respond with the first bolus, and they need another. You understand? So basically, what we do in clinical practice is this: 30 ml per kilo, you have a total deficit of 2.1. Give 2 liters of fluid in a sepsis protocol, right? In sepsis code. But many patients don't respond to that, right? So because you know you still have a deficit. So that deficit basically remains that half of that still remains as deficit, you can continue give another bolus of 5, meaning that, okay, give me 1 liter more, all right? And the rest, you can get it or remaining as a maintenance drip. But, so it's another way of
It
calculating
depends on the
maintenance.
patient, right?
Exactly. But if the patient responds to your first bolus, you don't need to worry about this because you already know how to calculate the maintenance portion. So basically, patient is in shock, you do 30 ml per kilo, you give 2 liters of fluid, and you continue this patient with 100 ml per hour because our calculation ended in 110. All the substance in plasma, either be given by me, could be me as a treatment, or them as a disease, that is also skewing the volume. Well, let me tell you that higher osmolarity than sodium and even higher than triglycerides are glucose. So if the patient is diabetic and has uncontrolled hyperglycemia, patient will be hyponatremic with high osmolarity. Guys, we're talking about hyponatremia so far. Only low sodium so far.
And that one is with a high osmolarity.
Wait. Let me just explain first and then a point. Okay? You already have this. You have been exposed to this already. So, what else can do that? Well, many things that we use in clinical practice. What about if you give a patient mannitol? Well, mannitol having high content of glucose has a high osmolarity. So if you give mannitol to the patient, it doesn't mean that you're gonna correct that because that's the goal, right? Unless it goes over 320, you don't correct that. But if you have a patient with stroke and the patient has cerebral edema and you give a patient mannitol, of course you need to increase the osmolarity to allow shift of water away from the brain up to 320. That's your goal. Do you understand so far? But what else can do that? Well, when you're preparing your patients for colonoscopy, and you give GoLively to the patient, the sorbitol is full of sugar. It's actually fructose. So it has a high osmolarity. And it doesn't mean that you're gonna correct that because you're preparing the patient for colonoscopy. The most you can do is give fluids after that. And we do. Okay? In addition, let's do a pyelogram. Let's do cardiac cath. Let's do CT angiogram. Every time you give a patient IV contrast, that's a hyperosmolar substance. You're increasing the osmolarity. And that's the reason why you give IV fluid right after, right? Because any hyperosmolar substance will suck fluid out of the cell and the patients might go into renal failure, therefore you have to give fluids. And you will correct the sodium at the same time. So far, so good? So, wait. Hyponatremia algorithm. If sodium controls osmolarity, osmolarity must be low if sodium is low. So far, good? How come it's normal? Well, it's normal, and it doesn't make any sense, because my patient has hypertriglyceridemia, lipid panel, right? And remember that the ATP3 guideline says that you give statins until contraindicated. LFTs, right? Elevated. Or rhabdomyolysis, right? Otherwise, if the triglycerides are greater than 500, niacin or fibrinic acid. You have that problem solved. Now, on the contrary, I have the patient coming with hyponatremia, but when you calculate the osmolarity, or when you request it, because sometimes it's easier for us to request it, but it takes a while. So you can do it yourself. We do it in the ICU, we calculate osmolarity. And it comes high. How come? Oh, maybe patient has blood sugar levels of 400. Insulin. Bring it down. As you bring the glucose down, the sodium will go up. Maybe it's the Golightly. Well, let me just give fluids to the patient. I'm dehydrating. Well, that's the purpose, to give diarrhea, right? Maybe it's the mannitol that I'm giving the patient for stroke, but I cannot remove the mannitol, if that was your choice, for cerebral edema, unless my osmolarity is greater than 320. So you're not gonna treat anything there. It could be IV contrast because I just took the patient for cardiac cath. You can't do anything there either, right? Just give fluids, and that will correct the sodium. Any questions?
We prende y blow glucosado.
The problem comes now. That's easy. So do you understand so far? Yes? Let's keep going. So, espérate un momentico, dime.
So contrast. Because
It's here, it's here. Don't, it's radio contrast. The problem is that you're writing at the same time I'm talking, and you have it right here in your eyes. Are you ready? Are you ready for the rest? The problem comes when I have low sodium and low osmolarity. That makes sense, right? It makes sense, right? Because sodium controls osmolarity. If osmolarity is low, sodium must be low. Do you understand that? Now, guys, let me ask you a question. If I have hyponatremia and I have hypoosmolarity, how do I know what is creating my hyponatremia? Let me tell you how you can lose sodium, or how can you lower the sodium. You don't intake the sodium properly, you lose it. Okay? Intake, loss. But you know that osmolarity is not only controlled by sodium, right? Who's controlled by at the same time? Aldosterone, reabsorption of sodium and water, right? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. And that movement of electrolytes is also mediated by the kidney, right? So you need to have a proper renal function as well, right? Yes so far? So, when you have a patient with hyponatremia, another way to have hyponatremia is that you actually have a normal sodium level, but you're diluting it, right? Because you have a lot of water that's diluting the sodium. So, you don't intake, you lose too much, right? Or you're diluting it, right? So, if I am diluting it, means that I have a volume overload state, right? Make sense? If I'm losing it, that means that I might be dehydrated. Somehow I'm losing it. Through the feces, through the kidney, through the perspiration, somewhere it's getting lost. So through the skin, through the kidney, through the GI tract. So think organs that can lose sodium, right? Or I'm diluting. Let's start. So listen to me. Don't write. We're gonna go again before I leave. So, if I have hyponatremia and hypoosmolarity, that means that my next step in action will be looking at the patient. See if the patient's dehydrated. How do you know a patient's dehydrated, guys? Dry skin, dry mucous membrane, skin turgor, right? Stenting, what else?
Low urine output.
Low urine output, hypotension, tachycardia, those are signs. Oh, but that's gonna be the sodium itself, it will do that. Huh? Increased BUN, thank you, and creatinine, right? Sometimes, of course, I'm not gonna go over, like, far and beyond, but you can look at the hemoglobin and hematocrit, but I'm not gonna go that far. So, if you come and see your patient and the patient looks dehydrated, that's one reason. So let's go baby steps. That could be one reason, right? Now, if you come and look at your patient, tell me signs and symptoms of volume overload. Feeling edema, ascites, anasarca, pulmonary edema, distension.
Maybe delusional hypotension.
No, like all the patients with sodium imbalance is gonna be alternative stuff.
So I would think.
Acute.
So in dehydration, the sodium is low. I thought it was high.
You could be dehydrated, you would see that, honey. You would see that, and we went through that already. If you're dehydrated, you could be hypo or hyper, both. Depending on the stage that you receive the patient. Okay? So far, questions for the test. When you have a patient with hyponatremia, what is the next step?
Check the patient.
No.
Is the osmolarity low or high?
Yes, thank you. That's the answer.
If it's
Check
normal or
osmolarity. Didn't we say?
Yeah.
If the osmolarity is normal, if the osmolarity is high, if the osmolarity is low.
Yeah.
That's the next step.
Right.
When you have hyponatremia with low osmolarity, what's the next step? Check the volume status of the patient. Check the patient. So far, so good? All right. All right. Let me go up. It's not difficult. It's not difficult. Wait,
We needed this like 2 classes ago.
wait. Let's talk about now, present. So, guys, let's start with dehydration. Tell me, how can you be dehydrated? Tell me renal cause, don't read, think. Renal causes and non-renal causes. How can you be dehydrated by renal causes? Renal failure, what else? Remember that renal failure, you think about oliguria. No, there's a second phase that is polyuria, so you be dehydrated. So renal failure, what else? Diuretic, that's the most common cause of dehydration, renally related. Look for the patient's medication list. Tell me another cause that is non-renal. Ooh, you're bleeding, you're burned, you're sweating, you're having vomiting, you're having diarrhea. So far, so good? So we have renal and non-renal. Guys, how do I know this is renal or non-renal? Write down, write down. I'm going to dictate to you. Need only 3 ways to lose sodium in the urine. And you're gonna dream with me. Is 1, the kidney is not working. The sodium is a very high macromolecule, guys. You do not expel sodium in the urine. When you do, that means that your filter is damaged. Right? So number 1, renal failure. Number 2, you're straining that sodium out. By how? Diuretics. Or 3, you have an autoimmune condition that could include aldosterone or ADH. Just learn it like that, and let's see if it's true. What's the normal reaction of the body if you're dehydrated? To lose sodium or conserve sodium? Conserve, because remember, sodium comes with water. So if you conserve sodium, you conserve water. So it doesn't make sense that if you're dehydrated by non-renal causes, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, etc., you're burned, you're bleeding, that you lose the sodium. Doesn't make sense, right? So you normally, your first reaction is to conserve sodium. So how can you lose it? Well, the only way you can lose it is that kidney is not conserving. And it's not conserving because you're in renal failure. Or you're forcing it out. Like if you get orange juice with high pulp, put it in a strain, it doesn't go. If you push it with a diuretic, right, it will go. The pulp will go down. And that doesn't mean that the filter is damaged, you're just forcing it out. Or you have an autoimmune condition, that could be again, hypothyroidism, diabetes, scleroderma, lupus, blah, blah, blah. All of them produce nephritis, right? Remember what I said, you have an autoimmune condition that could include aldosterone or ADH. Let me try to make more sense to this. Guys, what's the function of aldosterone? The absorption of sodium and water. So that means that if you have hypoaldosteronism, you get rid of the sodium in the urine. Right? Yes or no? Now, let me give you another autoimmune problem that leads to aldosterone problems. Remember that we have an HPA axis, right? And if you have low one hormone, you get the other hormone down in the axis low as well. Well, cortisol. Cortisol damages aldosterone. Anyhow, if you have, listen to this, don't write yet. If you have Cushing, high levels of cortisol will give you high levels of aldosterone. That doesn't apply, right? Because if you have high level of aldosterone, you reabsorb it in water. So you're gonna be hypernatritic. You understand? But what about if you have Addison's disease? That means you have low cortisol, that means you have hypoaldosteronism, and that means that you have excretion of sodium in the urine. Do you understand? Let's make it easier for the first test. Let's make it easier for the first test. So, let's go back to the algorithm. Just look at the algorithm to see if what I said is true. You have hyponatremia, okay? And what's the next step? To see if my patient is dehydrated, hypovolemic, or normal, which is called euvolemic, right? So, forget about this urine osmolarity so far. I'm gonna complicate it later with the acid-base. So far come here. My next step and question is, okay, I'm dehydrated? Yes. Okay. What's my urine sodium? Is it less than 20 or more than 20? The normal value is 20. So if you're less than 20, you're conserving. Diarrhea, vomiting, sweating.
Probably for non-renal.
Non-renal. If your sodium level in urine is greater than 20, that doesn't make sense. That means that you're not working as a kidney, you're giving me diuretics, or you have an autoimmune condition that could include aldosterone, look at here, mineralocorticoid deficiency, Addison's disease. Do you understand? Yes or no?
Yes.
Be honest. All right, let's go to the next. I am hypervolemic. Guys, tell me diseases that you know that the patients are in hypervolemia or volumomelia. CHF?
SIADH.
No.
Edema, pulmonary edema.
Ascites, which is cirrhosis of the liver. So CHF, cirrhosis of the liver, diseases, no states, diseases. Nephrotic syndrome, end-stage renal failure, right? So I have end-stage renal failure, which is a renal cause, right? And I have what? CSF, cirrhosis of the liver, nephrotic syndrome, which are non-renal. How do I know I'm in end-stage renal failure or I have CSF, cirrhosis, or nephrotic syndrome? Because in nephrotic syndrome, even though it sounds renal, it's only, that's 3 p.m. It's only protein being lost, okay? Yes, eventually, of course, the renal filter is damaged, blah, blah, blah. But I want you to be able to differentiate between end-stage renal failure and at least CSF and cirrhosis, so you don't get confused. How do you know that? No! Sodium in the urine. Sodium in the urine. Again, the only 3 ways to have sodium in the urine is by having renal failure, diuretics, or an autoimmune condition that could include aldosterone or ADH. Yes? So that means that end-stage renal failure is the hypervolemic, hyponatremic with a low osmolarity patient. Because the urine sodium will be greater than 20. Compared to my cirrhosis and CSF, which it will be less than 20. Do you understand? Good. Good, good, good. Now, but I am not dehydrated. I am not hypervolemic. When you assess the patient, the BUN is normal. The patient has a normal skin turgor. The mucus and skin is moist. There's no JVD. There's no flatness of the jugular vein. That patient is euvolemic.
Ready to go home.
How can you be euvolemic if you're hyponatremic? Basically means that you're drinking so much hypotonic fluid. Like the bottle gets bigger and bigger, right? But that's only water that when you reach the receptors of aquaporin, you pee it out, but you're not losing sodium. You're just basically compulsively drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking. Polydipsia. Okay? Do you understand? Or, as I told you, every time you drink alcohol, like beer or any type of alcohol, what do you lose only? Water. Because it's an inhibitor of ADH. Indirectly, it's not an illness. Okay? Do you understand? Now, you're drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking, and you're diluting the sodium, but my patient is not hypervolemic. Do you understand? You're diluting the sodium, but my patient is in a normal euvolemic state. Do you follow me? How do you think that patient's sodium will be? Normal. My kidneys are not damaged. I don't have an autoimmune condition, and I'm not taking diuretics, right? Now, the other option is, what's the function of ADH? Reabsorption of water only. Water only. Right? So that means that if I have a syndrome of inappropriate anti-diuretic hormone, I am secreting too much ADH and I'm retaining fluid only, but the patient will never go to the point of hypovolemic state until late stages. Late stages. How do you think my sodium will be there? High in the urine. High, guys. In the urine. High. Why? Because the only 3 ways to have sodium in the urine is to have renal failure, diuretics, or an autoimmune condition that could include aldosterone or ADH. Correct? You're not losing sodium. You're diluting the sodium. You're diluting the sodium. It's going to be diluted. But the patient itself, when you assess the patient, they're not in hypervolemic state. The plasma is diluted. The extracellular space is diluted, but not the interstitial, only the plasma. Remember that at the beginning, I left that slide for a reason, right? ICF and ICF. And ECF is divided into interstitial and plasma, right? So you're diluting plasma, therefore you're diluting sodium, but that fluid is not going into interstitial. That's the reason why the patient doesn't have edema.
So that happened in diabetes insipidus?
That's hypernatremia.
So then this would be.
And anxiety.
Yes, that's syndrome of inappropriate anti-diuretic
And
hormone,
the urine.
SIAD. High. Of course, many times, in Patho and Farm. So before I leave, let's refresh again, because it's coming to your test, for sure. For sure. Okay. My sodium is 112. Or go away from the party.
So that's like political.
Yes, yes.
But then you
Yes.
have to go and check hormones.
Why? Why?
The first thing you have to do is restrict.
You're thinking about psychogenic diabetes insipidus. Stop your thought process. Do you understand that? So, treatment-wise, for the first exam, and only for the first exam, I will allow you to use the algorithm. I'll bring it. Don't copy, don't write on it. You're wasting your time. I'll bring an empty one. Clean. Yes. For the first exam only. I mean, for the first time you use it, for the final, no. You have to think, okay? Because this, tons of questions on your board examination. Tons of questions. And you won't have the algorithm in front of you, okay?